Good morning, everybody at Seacrest, and hi there. This is Hi There with Rabbi Leah. Welcome to Tuesday and welcome to February. Hard to believe that we are already in the second month of our new secular year. First and foremost, I want to explain and apologize for my background today. It's not exactly Judaic, but I hosted a Zoom baby shower for my son and daughter-in-law yesterday afternoon, and I have just not had time to take down the decorations and put them away. And so you don't see my Moda Ani Lifanecha up there today. You only see the baby decorations. I promise that by Shabbat they will be down. So I want to get started today, and I decided I wanted to take a look at a subject that is near and dear to all of our hearts right now, and to see if there is specifically a Jewish history surrounding this particular subject. And, sometimes you come up with a lot of stuff, and sometimes you come up with nothing. And in this case, I came up with a lot of information, and I was really, I can't say I was pleasantly surprised because the subject is not so pleasant, but I was surprised. So I thought that um, in the middle of this pandemic, which some have called a plague, that I would do a few sessions on Judaism and plagues, because this isn't the first time that we've had a worldwide pandemic, and plagues have actually played a significant role in Jewish history. So, in in honor of the fact that we have just finished Vayishlach, the Torah portion last week, which was the story of the final three plagues visited upon the Egyptians, the Israelites' hasty departure from Egypt, and so on, that it might be an appropriate time to talk about plagues. So that's what I'm going to do, and I hope that you'll find this as interesting as I did. And doing my research, I actually came across an article written by a uh, professor of mine from Hebrew Union College, who's now at the University of Connecticut, and she was my professor of Hebrew literature. Her name is Dr. Susan Einbinder, and just fascinating that there are even symposiums in the Jewish world on the subject of fasts and so on. So I hope that you glean something from this. I hope that you will find the material interesting and infectious. Sorry about that. And I hope that it sheds some light on some of the other plagues that our people have gone through. Not that we're the only ones going through COVID-19, but just to reflect on how Jews and how the world around Jews have responded to various plagues throughout the millennia. So here we go. In Jewish history, you really don't have to look too far to find the subject of plagues, which is actually an overwhelming feature in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm not just talking about the Torah, but I'm talking about throughout the Hebrew Bible, including the second section of the Hebrew Bible known as the Nevi'im, which is the historical books and the prophets, and as well as in Ketuvim, which is the writings, which contains things like Esther and Job and Ruth and Lamentations, Psalms, Song of Songs, Jonah, Job, and so on. So throughout the Hebrew Bible, there is an overwhelming focus on the plague and just what it is, when it comes, why it afflicts, who it afflicts, and so on. We have Plagues don't always take on a negative connotation, by the way, at least not for the Jewish people. And in fact, there are two very significant periods in Jewish history when plagues actually saved the Jewish people. The first one that we know of course, is the 10 plagues that were rained down on the Egyptians by God when Moses was trying to get the Israelites permission to leave Egypt after 430 years of slavery. And so important are these plagues that we actually recite them at our Seders, our Passover Seders, and everybody knows them probably either in the Hebrew or the English by heart. And we go through a process during the recitation of the plagues where we dip a finger into the cup of wine, either your pinky or whatever you want, and we spill a little of the wine onto a plate. And then traditionally, you're not supposed to lick your finger because we don't want to benefit from the sweetness of the wine, given that the fate of the Egyptians was a terrible one, and the plagues were horrible for them to endure. So 10 plagues, and a lot of midrashim, a lot of discussion by the rabbis and others about who these plagues were for. Now we know, when I say who were they for, they impacted one people in one way, and they impacted another group of people in a completely different way. For the Egyptians, they were impacted physically and emotionally by these plagues. So having to deal with the Nile River changing into blood, locusts which ate crops, winds that blew away whatever was left of the crops, animals dying from disease, cattle disease, and so on, lice, boils, darkness, fire and rain and hail coming from the heavens. And I didn't mention frogs. Let's not forget the frogs. That had to have been pretty horrific. And finally, the 10th plague, which took place at midnight, when Pharaoh and everybody in his household awoke to this ear-piercing scream because everybody in Egypt had death in their home. From the firstborn child to the firstborn of every flock and every herd, and so on. So the amount of death encountered by the Egyptians was enormous. We know that these plagues were not perpetrated upon the Israelites, that they were saved from the plagues, including the final plague, the death of the firstborn of every species, by slaughtering a lamb, putting the blood on the lintel of the home, which is the lintel, also known as a mezuzah, which is the door frame, and thereby instructing the destroyer, the mashchit, the sometimes called the angel of death, to pasach, to pass over those homes. So these plagues were twofold in purpose. One was to convince the Egyptians of the might and power of the Israelite God, and that their Pharaoh, whom they also considered to be a god, didn't have nothing on the Israelite God. And so finally, Pharaoh called to Aaron and Moses after having spent a number of different occasions during which they pleaded with Pharaoh to allow the Israelites to go. The answer, of course, was always no. Sometimes Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Sometimes God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And finally, Pharaoh says, okay, guys, time to skedaddle, get out of Egypt. your God is stronger than anything we've seen, and yes, you may go. So the Egyptians learned the lesson about the Israelite God, Yahweh, Adonai, Yud He Vav He, Elohim, Hashem, um, Shaddai, whatever moniker you want to give to that supreme being. The Egyptians learned a lesson. At the same time, the Israelites were given an opportunity to see the incredible uh, commitment and might of the God worshipped by Moses and by Aaron and by Miriam. And were able to gain a greater sense of the commitment that that God had to the Israelite people from a brit, a covenant that had been made with them years and years and years before with their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that they would eventually inherit the land, that they would have progeny, they would have many, many, many children, that they would have wealth in terms of land and animals and so on and so forth. And finally, that God would take these people to be his own Amsagula, which means treasured people. Some have translated that as chosen people. I tend to try to stay away from that term chosen because I think that it exhibits a sense of superiority. And Jews were chosen by God, but chosen for a specific purpose, which was to serve as an Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations for an ethical and a moral life. And so chosen reminds me of kickball in middle school, where you were chosen for a team. And if you were last or second to last, that was not a good thing. So I always got chosen last for volleyball. I don't know why, because I actually was able to play volleyball. I'm a great server. So I guess they figured that I wasn't really good at spiking the ball, which is probably true. So we have these plagues, and in the case of the plagues in Egypt, they really ended up serving the Jewish people because they were able to finally leave. And there's another episode in Jewish history where a plague saved the Israelites, and that was there was an Assyrian siege on Jerusalem. And at that time, King Hezekiah, if you've read any of the historic books of the Bible, in order to thwart the attempt of the Assyrians to breach the walls of Jerusalem, Hezekiah shut down the water cisterns and the water system that went into the parts of Jerusalem that were outside of the walled city, so that only the Jews who lived in the city and moved into the city were able to get fresh running water. As a result, the Assyrians were drinking water that historians believe may have been contaminated because the cisterns were plugged up. So what they were drinking from was most likely water that had been sitting there for some time. And who knows, dysentery. We know that water supplies can bring all kinds of horrible viruses, plagues, and so on. Historically, I don't think that the ancient Jews or any other peoples at that time had any idea of the difference between a virus, a bacteria, a plague, a flu. They just knew that These were all things that got them sick. So it's believed the water supply was contaminated, giving the Assyrians a plague and thereby thwarting their attempts to besiege Jerusalem. There are, believe it or not, nearly 70 references to plagues and different types of pestilences in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm not just talking about the Torah, but I'm talking about the entire Tanakh, the entire Hebrew Bible. And there are actually at least 5 Hebrew words that refer to plagues or are used for the word plagues. In Hebrew, the most common term is magefa, although there are other words related to it as well. So it can mean slaughter, a disease, a strong blow, somebody who hits somebody else with a strong blow, or a death blow. So it's kind of like the Alaskans have, the Inuit people, the indigenous people have a multitude of words for snow. And in the Hebrew Bible, we have not a multitude, but several different terms for plague, depending upon exactly what kind of plague it is. So 70 examples, that's a huge number of examples, and that doesn't include other examples that we find in post-biblical rabbinic literature. So, two of the better known examples that we all are aware of. First and foremost, the greatest sin of all Jewish transgressions was the worship of the golden calf. And when scholars are talking or the rabbis were writing and they used the words the sin, that was the sin they were talking about, was the sin of the golden calf. And that resulted in a terrible decimation of the Israelites. Remember, Moses came down from Mount Sinai. He'd been up there for not quite 40 days. The Israelites were getting anxious and impatient and didn't want to wait for him to come back. They asked Aaron to build them a golden calf. The story goes that they took their earrings and so on and threw them into the fire, and that lo and behold, this golden calf came out. And Moses, of course, was furious about this because he had been up on the mountain getting the tablets inscribed by God. And so there was a terrible, terrible decimation of the Israelites by God, until finally Moses interceded and said, God, you promised after the flood that you would never kill these people off again. You have a covenant and a promise to us. And the second major event that we see in which a plague is involved takes place later in the book of Numbers, and the episode is the episode of the spies, where Moses decides to select one scout or spy to go out into the new land and scout it out and check it out. And he selects one person from each tribe, including Joshua and Caleb, and they go out to the new land and they look around and they come back. And 10 of the spies tell all of the Israelites who are gathered there that the land is beautiful and prosperous, and it is fertile, and there's beautiful, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. But then they say that the enemies there are so powerful and outnumber us so much that they're huge, and that we're going to look like little bugs to them, and they will crush us. And of course, when the Israelites hear this, they become hysterical and won't listen to reason. And when Caleb and Joshua finally say, wait a minute, gang. Yes, it is a magnificent land flowing with milk and honey, and we will prosper in this land. And yes, there are enemies there, but we have God on our side, and we will prevail in whatever battles we have to fight against these enemies. Unfortunately, by that time, they are overwrought. And as we might say in Yiddish, they were very verklempt, and they don't want to listen to reason. So Moses once again pleads to God and says, what am I going to do about these people? They are incorrigible. They cannot be trusted to believe in you. And for their lack of faith in God's ability, there is a massive plague that overtakes the people. God punishes them. And the major punishment, in addition to the plague, which is not a minor punishment, is that they are then told that they are going to have to roam the desert and not go into the promised land until everyone who came out of Egypt initially has died. Anyone who was 20 or under when they came out of Egypt, and anyone born on the journey and during the time they're in the wilderness will be allowed to go into the land. But that older generation is going to have to die off because they're still in their heads thinking like slaves. And so they are punished. And it turns out that it takes 38 years, another 38 years. This is 2 years into the journey. It takes another 38 years for them to have that entire slave generation die out. And so, 40 years altogether, and that's where we get 40 years in the desert. Some would like to say it's because Moses wouldn't ask for directions, but that's not the case. So that was certainly those two plagues, the plague following the golden calf and the plague following the incident with the spies, are two very well-known ones. There have been some others that I'm sure you know about. God brought a plague on the people because they were weary of manna and they wanted to eat meat. So the way that the manna worked was every night the manna fell. The people would get up in the morning and collect it, and they would have food to eat all day. What manna was exactly, we don't know. But that didn't stop the rabbis from trying to explain what it was. And on Friday, a double portion would come on Thursday night. And on Friday morning, the Israelites would gather that double portion. And so, there were times when they became impatient and didn't know the difference between immediate and long-term gratification, and ate both portions because they weren't allowed to gather on Shabbat. So they'd eat all their manna on Friday, and there was none left over for Saturday. So God became a little overwrought with them, a little angry with them, and they wanted to eat quail, and he gave them quail. But while they were chewing it, they were smitten with this, not smitten, excuse me, smitten? Yes, they were smote. Is that the past tense of smite? They were smited. They were smote with an ailment because of these small-minded complaints that they had about food. So be careful. Be careful about complaining about food because you never know what might happen. So an unusual plague is the case of also impatience that the people had in the wilderness. And God there were several instances where the people became impatient. And God, in this case, brought fiery, deadly serpents. And in order to save the people, Moses made a brass serpent. and that serpent became venerated by the Israelites, and it ended up as an object of worship in the temple. Now, as you know, Jews do not venerate symbols like that, which is why we don't have things like crucifixes and pictures of saints and things like that in Jewish practice, and you won't see a synagogue. Perhaps there will be beautiful stained glass, but it isn't venerated. It's there as a as hidur mitzvah, which means to beautify the mitzvah, just like we put beautiful coverings on our talitot, on our Torah scrolls. So when Hezekiah, the king who blocked off the cisterns so the Assyrians got sick and couldn't come into Jerusalem, destroyed that serpent that had been in the temple in order to restore pure monotheism to the Jewish people, because it was a cultic type piece that people were worshiping as opposed to worshiping God. So I can think of other examples of plague, but what we see is God's anger always interspersed with God's loving words. He's like a parent who's, very hard in their rebukes when they're raising children, and very affectionate in consoling. And at one point, we read about a foreign prophet whose name is Balak, who is sent, or Bilam, who's sent out by Balak, the king, to curse the Jewish people, is unable to curse the Jewish people and ends up blessing them by saying, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. And it's interesting to see that almost immediately after this episode with this foreign prophet who tries to curse the people and ends up blessing them, we have another almost immediate case of idolatry, where the men are allowed themselves to be seduced by the Midianite women, and they engage in idolatry and they engage in harlotry. And again, another plague comes down, and that plague, interestingly enough, required one of the priests, whose name was Pinchas, Phineas, if you want to give it the English translation, saw an Israelite man go into a tent with a Moabite woman, and it was clear what they were about to do. And so Pinchas followed them into the tent, and while they were laying on the ground, he speared them both through the belly. And one would think that that kind of an act of zealotry and murder would inflame God, but instead, God actually praised Pinchas because he was following the laws of not messing around with women who weren't Israelite women. And this guy, whose name was, the woman's name was Cosby, and now I'm going blank on the man's name. But in any event, that it was this priest, Pinchas, who is kind of touted as the one who saved the Israelite people from another plague by killing this Midianite woman and the Israelite who was with her. There are really famous warnings about plagues in a couple of different Torah portions that are read during the yearly cycle, and parts of them are so terrifying that we don't like to read them. More about that in the next episode of Hi There with Rabbi Leah. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope that that you're learning something. I know I certainly did while I was researching it. And this will show again on Thursday at 2, and then next week again. Thank you for joining me for Hi There, Lehitraot. Bye bye.